When German pilots first caught sight of the Bristol Beaufighter in late 1940, they sized it up the same way any seasoned aviator would, and at first glance, it didn't look like anything to lose sleep over. Compared to their sharp, needle-nosed BF-1EO9s, this new British machine looked oversized, almost swollen through the middle. 2 engines, yes, but a shape that seemed more farm tractor than frontline fighter. Early intelligence reports echoed the same opinion. Big, heavy, slow to turn. In the Luftwaffe's ready rooms, more than a few crews shrugged it off as something they could dance circles around. That smug confidence survived right up until the first trigger pull. What the Germans couldn't see during those early sightings was the brutal surprise hidden underneath the Beaufighter's nose. A tightly packed row of 4 20mm Hispano cannons wedged into its belly. These weren't scattered wing guns that needed careful convergence. These were 4 barrels pointed almost exactly forward, pouring their fire into a single, punishing stream no more than a meter wide at combat range. When a Beaufighter pilot pressed the trigger, he wasn't firing a burst. He was unleashing a storm. Each cannon spat out high-explosive shells, roughly the size and weight of a small apple, traveling close to the speed of sound. One shell alone could tear through a metal frame, smash control lines, or turn a fuel tank into a fireball. Multiply that by 4 cannons, each cycling hundreds of rounds a minute, and you get the Beaufighter's true signature move. In just 2 seconds, around 80 explosive shells filled the sky in front of it. That was all it ever needed. German bomber crews quickly learned these numbers weren't theory. Aircraft like the Heinkel 111 or Dornier 17 could take hits from rifle-caliber guns and still limp home with holes patched and nerves rattled. But when the Beaufighter opened up, the results were catastrophic. Wings snapped from their roots. Fuselages folded. Engines vanished in a flash of flame. Airmen described aircraft simply coming apart. Not damaged, not crippled. Erased. One Luftwaffe pilot who survived a Beaufighter attack over the Channel in early 1941 later told his debriefing officers that he'd never seen anything like it. His unit was flying home in formation when the British fighter drifted upward beneath them. It fired from what he thought was far too much distance to be dangerous. And the lead aircraft in front of him didn't just fall away. It detonated. In seconds, the calm of their return flight turned into chaos and shock. Suddenly, maneuverability didn't matter much. Dogfights weren't dogfights. They were over before anyone had the chance to turn. And this terrifying punch wasn't an accident of design. It came from Britain's desperate situation in 1940. The RAF needed a multi-purpose workhorse, something that could escort bombers far beyond the reach of the Spitfire and Hurricane, something that could help Coastal Command hunt submarines choking Britain's supply lines, something with range, endurance, and firepower all wrapped into one frame. The Beaufighter was that answer, a machine built for grim necessity, not elegance. And when the fighting began, the Germans discovered just how deadly necessity could be. Britain's situation in 1940 was a mess of overlapping emergencies. The Royal Navy needed aircraft that could guard convoys far out in the Atlantic, distances no single-engine fighter could dream of reaching. At the same time, Fighter Command was begging for a night fighter big enough to carry the new airborne radar systems being developed in secret labs. Those early radar sets were bulky, power-hungry, and far too heavy for Spitfires or Hurricanes. Normally, solving all of this would mean starting a brand new design. That would take 3 to 4 years in peacetime. But wartime Britain didn't have years. France had fallen. The Blitz was building. The Air Ministry needed something fast, something practical, something that could be flying yesterday. This is where Leslie Fries, Bristol's chief designer, made a bold move. Instead of creating an elegant new fighter from the ground up, he took a completely different route. He built one out of parts already sitting in factories. The wings? Lifted straight from the Beaufort torpedo bomber. The tail? Borrowed from the Blenheim light bomber. The engines? Hercules radials, already rolling off assembly lines. Even the landing gear was adapted rather than invented. It was aircraft design done like emergency carpentry. Take what's strong, what's available, and put it together fast. And incredibly, it worked. Fries's team went from the first sketch to a flying prototype in 9 months. The Beaufighter took its first flight on July 17, 1940, a speed of development that was unheard of. To put that in perspective, Germany's Bf-110 heavy fighter took almost 3 years to go from paper to combat-ready. Britain did the same job in less than a third of the time. Using Beaufort wings also brought an accidental gift. Those wings were built to carry a torpedo almost the weight of a small car, roughly 900 kilograms, slung under the fuselage. That meant the structure was vastly stronger than anything a normal fighter needed. Strength that just so happened to be perfect for handling the recoil and weight of 4 Hispano cannons, plus 6 wing-mounted machine guns. And because the Beaufighter inherited the Beaufort's wide, roomy fuselage, there was suddenly space for everything Britain desperately needed. Radar sets, a second crew member to operate them, and huge fuel tanks that gave the aircraft legs, more than 2,500 kilometers of range. That made it ideal for night fighting, maritime patrol, and long-distance interception. In a strange way, the Beaufighter wasn't designed in the traditional sense at all. It was assembled, built from bomber bones, powered by bomber engines, strengthened by bomber wings. It was big because bombers were big. It was tough because torpedo bombers had to survive violent low-level missions. And it could fly forever because patrol aircraft lived their lives far from home. It wasn't meant to dogfight Bf-109s twisting through tight turns over the channel. It was built for Britain's real problems: hunting bombers at night, chasing U-boats at sea, and filling the gaps that no other aircraft could. No. 25. Squadron received the first operational Beaufighters in September 1940. One knee, barely over a year after design work began, and they were flying combat missions almost immediately. From idea to live combat in just over 12 months. In wartime aviation, that sort of speed was almost unbelievable. And its firepower? That's where another revolution happened. Mounting all 4 Hispano cannons in the belly instead of spreading them across the wings went against decades of proper fighter design. Most aircraft divided their guns across each wing to keep things balanced. Spitfires had 8 spread out along their wings, and the Bf-109 carried a mix of cowling guns and wing guns. Structurally, that made sense. But it introduced a hidden nightmare: convergence. Wing guns didn't fire straight ahead. They fired inward, set to meet at a chosen distance in front of the aircraft. Anything closer than that point or farther than it, and the pilot's firepower spread apart into empty air. The Beaufighter broke that rule entirely, and the results changed everything. Wing guns in most fighters of the era had a built-in flaw. They didn't point straight ahead. They were angled slightly inward so the bullets met at a chosen distance, usually somewhere around 200 to 300 meters. Hit a target closer than that and your round sailed past on both sides. Fire farther out and your stream split wide again. That meant a pilot had a very small, sweet spot, where all his guns truly worked together. The Beaufighter ignored that system entirely. Its 4 Hispano cannons were packed tightly into a box-shaped compartment under the cockpit, the barrels almost perfectly parallel and only a few centimeters apart. There was no crossing angle, no convergence distance, no guesswork. What came out of those barrels stayed grouped. Whether a pilot fired at 100 meters or 400, his shells landed in practically the same space. The spread widened a little with distance. Vibration and ammunition differences made that inevitable. But compared to traditional wing guns, the effect was tiny. That concentrated punch is what made the Beaufighter so terrifying. Picture 4 explosive shells hitting the same dinner plate-sized patch of metal almost at the same moment. The first cracks open the skin. The second blows apart the weakened frame. The second blows apart the weakened frame. The third rips deeper into the aircraft's guts. The fourth slips through the hole and detonates inside fuel tanks, oxygen bottles, or ammunition stores. It was a chain reaction that happened so quickly that bomber crews often thought their aircraft had been struck by flak, not another airplane. The Hispano Mk2 itself was an advanced weapon for its time. Originally French, refined in Britain, each cannon stretched about 2.5 meters and weighed a little over 40 kilograms. The ammunition came in different flavors: high-explosive incendiary, semi-armor-piercing incendiary, and training rounds. The high-explosive incendiary type, used most often in real combat, carried around 11 grams of explosive compound, more than enough to shred aluminum airframes and throw jagged fragments through internal compartments. During a standard 2-second burst, each cannon put out 16 to 20 shells. Multiply that by 4, and you're looking at 64 to 80 explosive rounds hitting the air in front of the Beaufighter. In sheer destructive mass, that tiny burst delivered more explosive force than some light bombers released in an entire attack pass. The truth is simple. The Beaufighter wasn't just a fighter. It was a compact artillery platform with wings. And it didn't stop there. To help the pilot see where his fire was going, Bristol added machine guns, 4, 303 Brownings in the wings, and on some variants, 2 more in the outer right wing. These weren't the main weapon. They were guides and psychological tools. The stream of tracers helped the pilot adjust aim, and just as importantly, made enemy crews duck or flinch in those first crucial seconds. By the time the cannons joined the fight, the damage was already inevitable. German crews learned the rhythm quickly. First came the glowing tracer lines. Then, a heartbeat later, the cannon bursts, which usually marked the end of the encounter. By late 1940, German intelligence finally got their hands on a wrecked Beaufighter near Dover. True to form, they measured everything. The wingspan, just over 17.5 meters. The fuselage length, about 12. 7. The empty weight, nearly 6. 8 tons, ballooning to around 9. 5 tons fully armed and fueled. On paper, it looked like a brute with too much weight and too much drag to fight gracefully. Their report labeled it exactly that. A heavy fighter. Emphasis on heavy. Yes, it had power. 2 Hercules engines producing about 1,400 horsepower each. But the analysts assumed all that energy vanished just hauling its enormous frame through the air. Their predicted top speed, around 515 km/h, seemed to confirm that belief. The Bf-110, they thought, had the edge with its reported 560 km/h. What those calculations failed to capture, completely, was the one truth the air crews later learned the hard way. Maneuverability stops mattering when your opponent only needs one firing pass to end the fight. German analysts made one basic mistake. They judged the Beaufighter as if it were meant to duel with fighters in broad daylight. They ran the numbers, turn radius, roll rate, climb, acceleration, and concluded it couldn't keep up with lighter single-engine machines. And in a sunny afternoon dogfight, they would have been right. But night fighting was an entirely different world. A Beaufighter didn't need to pirouette around the sky. It didn't need to outroll a Heinkel or outclimb a Junkers. All it needed was to slip within a few hundred meters without being noticed, hold a steady aim for 2 seconds, and then survive long enough to peel away. That was the whole job. Everything else was irrelevant. This misunderstanding seeped into German bomber briefings. Crews were told that if a Beaufighter appeared, they should pull into a tight turn. The assumption being that the big, clumsy British heavy fighter couldn't possibly stay with them. Several Ju-88 crews tried exactly that in early 1941, and the tactic turned out to be fatal. The Beaufighter pilot didn't bother following the turn at all. He simply waited for the bomber to finish its maneuver, settle back into a predictable line, and then fired. The frantic dodging only made the final strike easier. A sharper intelligence officer might have noticed what the Beaufighter was actually optimized for. Its large frame wasn't a flaw. It was the reason it could carry the AI Mech 4 radar. That early radar unit weighed nearly 90 kilograms and needed its own operator. Spitfires and Hurricanes couldn't fit the equipment, let alone the second crewman. The Beaufighter could. Its roomy interior let the radar operator work the screens comfortably, calling out range and direction to guide the pilot onto unseen targets in the blacked-out sky. The Germans understood the theory of airborne radar. Their own Liechtenstein set was in the works. But somehow they never connected the Beaufighter's bulk with its ability to carry an operational system months before they could. The Beaufighter's bomber-derived wings also gave it immense strength. Pilots could push it into steep, fast dives without worrying about tearing the aircraft apart. Luftwaffe crews reported attacks from above, where the British fighter dropped like a thrown hammer, fired in passing, and then blasted away before defensive gunners could even swing their weapons around. German intelligence dismissed these accounts as exaggerations born from fear. They insisted the Beaufighter was too heavy to dive like that. But by mid-1941, combat reports told a different story. Bombers were vanishing during night raids. No warnings, no radio calls, just missing from formation. When wreckage was found, the torn metal and shredded spars pointed to 20mm cannon strikes. Despite this, official German evaluations continued to label the Beaufighter as slow, unwieldy, and avoidable. Reality, however, was unfolding above Britain every night. During the height of the Blitz, streams of Luftwaffe bombers crossed the Channel guided by radio beams, striking London, Liverpool, Coventry, and countless other cities. British defenses were almost symbolic. Searchlights waved helplessly across empty sky. Anti-aircraft crews fired at shadows and engine noise. Single-engine fighters flew blind, hoping luck would drop a bomber in front of them. Only a tiny fraction, about 2%, of German aircraft ever encountered defenders. Then came the Beaufighter with its AI Mach 4 radar, and everything changed. The new system sent out bursts of radio waves and read the echoes bouncing back from enemy aircraft. The radar operator sat behind the pilot, eyes fixed on a small cathode ray display, maybe 20 centimeters wide. Enemy bombers appeared as little spikes of light, each one marking distance and direction. On a good night, the radar could spot a bomber between 4 and 8 kilometers away. Suddenly, interception wasn't guesswork anymore. It became a process. Night fighting in the early years of the war was unlike anything the world had seen before. The men flying Bristol Beaufighters were slipping into a new kind of combat, silent, unseen, and terrifyingly close. On the ground, radar stations scanned the coastline and pointed these hunters toward the rough patch of sky where enemy bombers wandered. Once the Beaufighter was in the neighborhood, the real work began. Inside the cockpit, the radar operator guided the pilot with calm, clipped instructions. Bearing, distance, altitude changes. Slowly, almost gently, the pilot eased the aircraft into position, staying low and tucked behind the German bomber's blind spot. At 200 or 300 meters, the black silhouette of a Heinkel or Dornier would finally take shape. Just a darker shadow against an already dark sky. And then came the moment every night fighter pilot remembered. A slight nudge on the controls, a breath, a 2-second squeeze of the trigger, and the bomber didn't drift, didn't spiral, didn't burn its way down. It simply fell apart. Flight Lieutenant Ronald Ashford of No. 604 Squadron once described a kill over Kent in January 1941. His operator had picked up a faint contact nearly 6 kilometers out. Ashford closed in, easing up behind a Heinkel 111 whose crew had absolutely no idea death was approaching. From barely 70 meters back, almost point-blank range, Ashford lined up his cannons and fired. The Heinkel split. Literally. The tail ripped away from the fuselage, the wings sheared off, and the wreckage began. Sheared off, and the wreckage began, falling in pieces before Ashford even released the trigger. The Beaufighter's firepower wasn't just effective, it was catastrophic. For German crews, night combat was a nightmare. In daylight you could see your enemy, maneuver, fire back. At night you saw nothing. No shape in the darkness, no engine glare, no warning. Your first and only clue that a Beaufighter was hunting you was the sudden thud of cannon shells punching through metal. By that point the fight was already over. Between late 1940 and the spring of '41, Beaufighter squadrons only claimed a bit more than 100 kills. But those numbers hide the truth. These weren't easy daytime victories. They were pitch-black interceptions that older systems would have missed completely. And the psychological toll on the Luftwaffe was enormous. Crews began whispering about the invisible British fighter that appeared from nowhere. Some even begged for reassignment to daylight missions, anything to avoid the horror of a predator you couldn't see. The Beaufighter didn't need to clear the skies. It only needed to make every German crew fear crossing them. By early 1942, its reputation as a bomber killer was secure. But along the coast, a different plan was taking shape. Something bolder. Coastal Command wanted to use the Beaufighter's bite against ships. 3 German giants were sitting in the French port of Brest. The battle cruisers Scharnhorst and Gneisenau, and the heavy cruiser Prinz Eugen. They'd been sheltered there for months, repairing battle damage while British bombers threw everything they had at them. Nothing worked. The ships survived and the British aircrews paid in blood. Hitler grew impatient. He didn't want his prized warships trapped in France, so he ordered them home, through the English Channel, in broad daylight no less. The German naval staff practically begged him to reconsider. Sailing capital ships that close to British guns and aircraft seemed suicidal. Hitler didn't care. The operation, codenamed Cerberus, went ahead. Just before midnight on February 11, 1942, the German flotilla slipped out of Brest. And by a mix of bad weather, radar glitches, and pure luck, they went completely unnoticed until the next morning. By the time the British realized what was happening, the ships were already racing up the French coastline, shielded by destroyers, E-boats, and a thick umbrella of fighter cover. The Royal Navy threw everything it had into the chase: motor torpedo boats, destroyers, bombers, fighters, anything that could still fly or float. And into this chaos roared the Coastal Command Beaufighters. These weren't the delicate night-fighting machines loaded with radar gear. These were brutes. Some carried the usual battery of cannons. Others lugged torpedoes beneath their bellies. The torpedo-carrying variants skimmed barely above the waves, lining up for strikes from less than a kilometer away, a heartbeat in naval terms. Around them the air turned into a storm. Messerschmitt 109s and Focke-Wulf 190s cut through the sky, carving up the British formations. Anti-aircraft fire erupted from the German ships in sheets. Pilots flew so low their propellers sent sprays of seawater behind them. What followed was one of the most frantic, desperate running battles of the entire war. The German convoy pushing up the channel didn't just rely on fighters overhead. Every ship bristled with guns, layers of them, creating floating fortresses that spat fire in every direction. When the British counterattack finally slammed into them, the sky erupted. Tracers arced across the water, air bursts flashed like lightning, and the whole channel felt like it had turned into a steel furnace. But the Beaufighter crews pressed in anyway. They flew so low they could see their own reflections flicker in the waves. Cloud cover kept visibility miserable. Patches of snow ripped across the horizon. But they pushed on, determined to punch a hole in the German defenses. One of the men leading the charge was Flight Lieutenant James Pitkin Hill of No. 86 Squadron. His aircraft carried no torpedo, just raw firepower. His job was simple and suicidal: silence the destroyers so other aircraft could slip through. Pitkin Hill took his flight straight at the German screen. In his report, he described coming in close enough to count the rivets on a destroyer's hull. He fired a long, brutal burst, raking the ship from bow to stern. Explosions marched across the deck like a chain reaction. For a moment, the destroyer's guns simply stopped. But the sea was full of predators. Another escort locked onto him immediately, and a burst of fire tore into his Beaufighter. One engine sputtered out. The fuselage was chewed apart. Somehow, through sheer will, he coaxed the crippled aircraft back across the channel and crash-landed at Manston. He climbed out, alive, staring at a machine that looked barely capable of standing upright. Despite the courage of the attackers, the torpedo runs were largely ineffective. The German capital ships were ready for them. They zigzagged violently, kept up high speeds, and forced most torpedoes to miss. One may have hit Scharnhorst, but it was a dud. Torpedo reliability was infamously awful at this stage of the war. Still, the Beaufighter crews proved something important. The aircraft could fight in conditions that would break lesser machines. It could maul destroyers. It could take punishment and survive. And those lessons, learned in blood, would be priceless in the next chapter of the war. Atay, the Mediterranean. The Beaufighter's hunting ground. After the embarrassment of the Channel Dash, Coastal Command took a hard look at how to fight ships more effectively. Meanwhile, across the Mediterranean, a perfect storm was forming. Axis armies in North Africa, Rommel's Africa Corps and their Italian allies, depended on an enormous lifeline stretching back to Europe. Every drop of petrol, every shell, every spare part had to cross several hundred kilometers of open water from Italy to ports like Tripoli, Benghazi, and Tobruk. Without that constant flow, the desert offensive would starve to death. The Allies had submarines and surface ships prowling the region. But in early 1942, The central Mediterranean still belonged largely to the Axis. Airfields in Sicily, Crete and Libya gave German and Italian fighters the advantage. Then the Beaufighters arrived. At first they trickled into Malta and North Africa in small groups, but by mid-1942, entire strike wings were operational. Tight formations of Beaufighters paired with Bristol Beaufort torpedo bombers. It was a lethal combination. The tactics, however, had to be invented the hard way. Early missions were disasters. Crews flew in at medium height, like standard strike aircraft, and paid the price. Merchant ships and their escorts filled the sky with fire. Losses were staggering. Some units saw a third of their aircraft destroyed within a single month. Then the pilots made a discovery that changed everything. The Beaufighter's rugged, heavy frame, which made it awkward as a day fighter, became its secret weapon at sea. The aircraft could be slammed through rough, turbulent air at wave level without shaking itself apart. Lighter aircraft struggled. The Beaufighter didn't. So they started flying in at terrifyingly low altitude, just a few meters above the water, slipping under radar and giving enemy gunners almost no time to react. It was risky, but it worked. An attack run became a kind of violent choreography. The Beaufighters lined up in single file, each aircraft spaced a few seconds apart. The lead pilot charged at a merchant ship's waterline, firing from about 600 meters. The four nose-mounted cannons punched holes straight through steel. They didn't sink ships by themselves, but they created chaos. Superstructures shattered. Ammunition lockers exploded. Fuel lines ruptured. Anti-aircraft crews were killed or scattered. By the time the second and third Beaufighters came roaring in, the ship's defensive fire had shriveled to almost nothing. And behind them came the Beauforts, swinging in for their torpedo drops against a target that was half-blind and already burning. The results were astonishing. Between June and November 1942, Beaufighter strike forces helped sink or damage more than 90 Axis vessels, around 300,000 tons of shipping. For comparison, German U-boats in the Atlantic sank. Far more tonnage overall, but they operated with hundreds of submarines over an entire ocean. The Mediterranean Beaufighters never had more than about 60 aircraft ready at once. Measured per aircraft, the Beaufighter teams outperformed the U-boats. Their impact on the ground war was immediate. By late 1942, Rommel's advance into Egypt stalled, not because British tanks stopped him, but because his supply lines were dying. Convoys ran out of fuel. Ammunition ships burned. Italian captains flatly refused to sail unless they had overwhelming air cover. And the Luftwaffe couldn't spare enough fighters. The Mediterranean had turned into a death zone for Axis supply ships, and the Beaufighter was at the center of it. German records recovered after the war revealed just how catastrophic the situation had become. By October 1942, fewer than 1 in 3 tons of supplies shipped from Italy were actually reaching North Africa. Everything else, food, fuel, munitions, spare parts, was either burning on the surface or scattered across the seabed. One Beaufighter pilot, Flight Lieutenant Arthur Gill of No. 272 Squadron, kept his own quiet score. His logbook was blunt to the point of cold. Attacked 3 merchants off Lampedusa, 2 left ablaze. A dozen words for an action that doomed hundreds of tons of Axis materiel. Now multiply that by every crew, every squadron, every 5-ship convoy intercepted along the Tunisian and Libyan coastlines. The result wasn't just tactical disruption. It was the slow strangulation of an entire army. And while the Mediterranean turned into a feeding ground for Beaufighter strike wings, another corner of the world began demanding the same brutal capabilities, only on an even harsher scale. The Pacific, a theater that broke aircraft and pilots. What awaited the Beaufighter in the Pacific dwarfed anything it had faced in Europe. Distances were enormous. A single strike mission could cover 1,600 kilometers or more. The weather was a constant enemy. Blinding tropical storms, crushing humidity, salt air that corroded electrical systems, and blistering heat that tortured engines. And then there were the Japanese fighters. The A6M-0 could turn inside anything the Allies had. If a Beaufighter tried to dogfight a Zero, the outcome was almost predetermined. The Royal Australian Air Force received its first Beaufighters in late 1942, with No. 30 Squadron transitioning from the older Beauforts. But these weren't off-the-shelf aircraft. They were tropicalized, modified specifically for the brutal realities of the Pacific. They carried enlarged air filters to cope with dust and sand kicked up from jungle airstrips, improved oil coolers to keep engines from overheating in the suffocating heat, moisture-protected radios to survive the constant sweat of the tropics, additional fuel tanks that pushed endurance past 6 hours, and then came the dedicated Pacific variant, the Mark Vic, arriving in early 1943. It carried everything the Mediterranean Beaufighters had, plus rockets, 8 RP-3 projectiles under the wings, each carrying a 27-kilogram warhead, with 4 cannons, 6 machine guns, rockets, and the ability to sling a torpedo. The aircraft became one of the most heavily armed strike platforms in the entire war. New Guinea and the Bismarck Islands, hunting at dawn. The campaign opened in earnest in mid-1943. Japanese convoys moved along the New Guinea coastline at night, threading through narrow channels to reach garrisons in Rabaul, Wewak, and Lae. The RAAF adapted fast. They began flying at the very edge of darkness, dawn and dusk patrols, when the Zero was least effective and the Japanese least alert. They skimmed the waves at treetop height, appearing out of the gloom like shadows with teeth. And then came the battle that cemented the Beaufighters' legend in the Pacific, the Battle of the Bismarck Sea. March 1943. On March 2nd, a Japanese convoy, 8 transports and a screen of destroyers, was spotted moving troops toward Lae. Nearly 7,000 soldiers were packed aboard. They never arrived. Over 2 punishing days, Allied air power descended on the convoy. American bombers came in from medium altitude. Australian Beaufighters stormed in at mast height, their cannons hammering decks, shredding anti-aircraft crews, and turning the transports into flaming death traps. Every transport, every escort, gone. Out of roughly 7,000 men, fewer than 1,000 survived to reach land. Beaufighter pilots later described their cannon fire ripping straight through wooden superstructures, slicing open fuel drums, igniting ammunition caches. The ships didn't just sink, they erupted. The message to Japan was unmistakable. Your convoys aren't safe anywhere. Burma and the Bay of Bengal. Another front, same fear. By late 1943, Beaufighter operations pushed westward into Burma. No. 27 Squadron, flying out of bases in eastern India, began hammering Japanese supply vessels along the Burma coast and deep into the Bay of Bengal. The conditions were no less harsh, and the distances no shorter. But the pattern remained the same. Low-level attacks, devastating firepower, ships crippled before their gunners even understood they were under attack. The Beaufighter had transformed from a desperate wartime improvisation into a global predator, one that terrorized shipping lanes from the Mediterranean to the Coral Sea. The crews who flew Bristol Beaufighters in Burma and along the Arakan coast knew one thing better than anyone. Every mission demanded endurance. Some flights stretched nearly 1,000 kilometers just to reach the enemy, engage in a fight, and limp home with fuel gauges hovering near empty. Yet despite the brutal distances, the aircraft carved out a reputation that spread quickly through Japanese ranks. By mid-1944, Allied intelligence had intercepted something remarkable. Japanese naval orders warning convoy escorts to scatter the moment twin-engine attackers appeared. Staying together, they said, only made them easier targets. Damaged ships weren't told to hold formation or fight back. They were instructed to run themselves aground if they wanted any chance of surviving. That's how devastating the Beaufighters' attacks had become. One report from August 1944, written by Wing Commander Mick Kerr of No. 31 Squadron, illustrates this reality with chilling clarity. Kerr described striking a medium Japanese cargo ship near Ambon. The opening rockets tore into the waterline, punching massive holes straight through the hull. Kerr followed with a pass of cannon fire that ripped across the deck like a zipper. When his flight withdrew, the ship was already burning, leaning heavily to one side. Coast watchers later confirmed it was gone within 10 minutes. While the Japanese were learning fast, the Germans had undergone their own painful education. Early in the war, they dismissed the Beaufighter as a heavy, clumsy twin-engine design. By 1944, that tune had changed completely. Late-war German assessments, including a January 1945 training document captured by the Allies, admitted that a Beaufighter that reached firing position was essentially unstoppable. Crews were warned not to rely on evasive turns or raw speed. Those tactics, once standard, simply didn't work. The only reliable survival strategy was to avoid interception entirely. Alter routes, use cloud cover, use terrain, and pray the British pilots never saw them. This wasn't defeatism. It was experience speaking. Luftwaffe loss records by 1944 showed a clear pattern. Bombers attacked by Beaufighters usually didn't make it home. A single burst from the aircraft's 4 nose-mounted cannons left enemy planes shredded beyond repair. Encounters with single-engine fighters might leave an aircraft damaged, but flyable. A Beaufighter pass usually meant the story was over. The psychological pressure was just as heavy. German bomber crews crossing the North Sea or the Mediterranean described feeling tension every time a twin-engine silhouette appeared far off. Was it friendly? Was it a Beaufighter? That hesitation, even for a few seconds mattered. Japanese sailors in the Pacific reported similar dread. The low thunder of Hercules engines meant incoming destruction with no meaningful way to fight back. Across all theaters, the numbers tell the same story. From 1940 to 1945, roughly 5,900 Beaufighters were built. They destroyed more than 5,700 enemy aircraft, most at night, and over 600 ships, amounting to well over 1 million tons lost. Those figures don't even include damaged vessels that later sank or aircraft that crashed while trying to escape. The cost to the Allied crews was heartbreaking. More than 800 Beaufighters lost in combat and around 2,000 airmen killed or captured. Even so, the exchange rate remained astonishing. For every Beaufighter shot down, almost 7 enemy aircraft were destroyed, not counting ships. After the war, surviving Luftwaffe pilots were interviewed about their experiences. Many openly admitted that the Beaufighter was one of the most feared aircraft of the entire conflict. Not because it was elegant or agile, but because it didn't need to be. It did exactly what it was built to do, and it did it with terrifying efficiency. One of Germany's top aces, a pilot credited with more than 200 victories, looked back in 1948 and admitted something that would have shocked his superiors during the war. From the viewpoint of bomber crews, he said, the Bristol Beaufighter was one of the most terrifying aircraft the Allies ever fielded, not because it lingered over a fight or chased bombers across the sky, but because its attacks were over almost before the crews understood what was happening. A single pass, a flash of cannon fire, and everything was decided. He explained that airmen sometimes survived fights with single-engine interceptors. Those fighters had to circle back, reposition, make repeated attempts. With a Beaufighter, there was no second chance. If it lined up a shot, the encounter was already lost. The Germans had once mocked the aircraft as heavy and slow, assuming those traits made it vulnerable. In reality, those shortcomings were part of its design logic. It wasn't built to dance through dogfights. It was built to carry the things that won the fight outright: radar sets, long-range fuel, and a weapons load that lighter fighters simply couldn't handle. Its entire purpose was to hit hard enough on the first strike that maneuverability stopped mattering. And in that role it excelled. When all 4 cannons fired together, 80 explosive rounds tore forward in a single devastating burst. Whatever they hit didn't have time to evade or recover. The Beaufighter didn't need agility. It needed accuracy, power, and surprise. And it delivered all 3 with chilling reliability.